You ever notice someone in a conversation who feels unusually present? Not loud, not dominating, not rushing to fill every silence like it's a fire alarm. They listen, fully, eyes steady, small nods, the kind of attention that makes you keep talking even when you hadn't planned to. And then, when they finally speak, it's brief, precise, almost surgical. One sentence, maybe two, and somehow it lands harder than a 5-minute monologue ever could. Maybe you know someone like this. Maybe it's you. People who listen fully but speak selectively have a strange effect on rooms. Conversations slow down around them. People reveal more than they intended. And afterward, others walk away thinking, that was a really good conversation, without quite knowing why. This isn't shyness. It's not social anxiety. And it's definitely not a lack of opinions. There's a quiet psychology underneath this behavior, one that shapes how trust forms, how power shifts in conversation, and how certain people manage their inner world without ever announcing it. Let's take a closer look at what's really going on, because once you see it, you'll never hear silence the same way again. Picture this. You're telling a story. Halfway through, you pause, expecting the usual interruptions, advice, jokes, comparisons. But instead, the other person stays still. No phone, no quick, yeah, totally. Just attention, real attention. Something in you leans forward. You add details you weren't planning to share. You clarify feelings you hadn't named yet. You talk longer than usual, and you don't feel embarrassed about it. That's the first type. The person who treats listening as an active skill, not a passive state. These people aren't quiet because they have nothing to say. They're quiet because they're doing something while you're talking. They're tracking tone shifts, noticing where your energy changes, sensing what you avoid as much as what you say. Psychologically, this kind of listening comes from high social attunement. Their attention is outward focused, but not scattered. They're reading the emotional weather of the conversation, and speaking too much would interrupt the data. For them, listening isn't waiting for their turn, it's the main event. And when they do speak, it's often to reflect something back to you, sometimes more clearly than you'd said it yourself. That sounded important. You got quieter when you mentioned that. It seems like you're torn, even if you're joking about it. Suddenly, the conversation deepens. If this is you, you might notice that people open up to you quickly. Strangers tell you personal things. Friends process their lives out loud around you. And sometimes that's exhausting, because listening fully requires emotional energy, and speaking selectively is how you protect it. Then there's another profile. This one often gets misunderstood. They're in group settings, a table of people, everyone talking, laughing, opinions flying, and they're quiet, not disengaged, not bored, just waiting. They let conversations run their course. They don't jump in to be heard. They don't compete for airtime. And when they finally speak, it's usually near the end, after patterns have emerged. And what they say reframes everything. This isn't introversion in the usual sense. It's strategic restraint. Psychologically, these people think in systems. They prefer to observe the full shape of a conversation before inserting themselves. Speaking too early feels premature, like answering a question before it's fully formed. They're often slow processors with high accuracy, not slow because they're behind, but because they're thorough. If this is you, you might relate to this feeling. By the time you've figured out what you want to say, the conversation has already moved on. And that's fine. You weren't trying to win the moment. You were trying to understand it. People like this often value precision over presence. They'd rather say one thing that actually matters than 10 things that simply keep them visible. In a culture that rewards quick takes and constant commentary, this can feel like a quiet rebellion, and sometimes it costs them. They may be underestimated, overlooked, labeled reserved or hard to read, but those who pay attention learn quickly. When this person speaks, it's worth listening. Now, here's where it gets more subtle. Some people listen fully and speak selectively because they learned early that words have consequences. Maybe they grew up in environments where speaking too freely led to conflict, misinterpretation, or emotional backlash. Maybe they were the peacemaker, the observer, the one who noticed tension before it exploded. So they learned to listen first. Psychologically, this creates a deep internal filter. Thoughts don't go straight to speech. They pass through layers of consideration. Is this necessary? Is this accurate? Will this help or complicate things? Silence becomes a form of emotional intelligence. If this resonates, you might notice that you often know what to say, but choose not to, not out of fear, but out of judgment. You've learned that not every truth needs to be spoken, and not every thought needs an audience. You might also feel misunderstood at times. People assume silence means agreement, or indifference, or detachment. But inside, there's a lot happening, and speaking selectively is how you stay regulated. The twist: over time, this can turn into emotional invisibility if you're not careful. Others may never learn where you stand because you've been so good at holding the space for them. Then there's a quieter, almost philosophical type. These people are deeply aware of how language distorts experience. They know that once something is spoken, it becomes fixed, reduced, simplified. So they hesitate, they listen, they think, they feel something complex and struggle to translate it into words without losing its texture. It's not just anger, it's not just sadness, it's something layered.
So they stay quiet longer, not because they're unsure, but because they're respectful of the experience itself. If this is you, you may feel frustrated by how fast conversations move, how quickly people summarize feelings, how often they rush to conclusions. You're not trying to be mysterious, you're trying to be honest. And honesty, for you, takes time. But here's the part most people miss. Listening fully and speaking selectively isn't just a personality trait. It's also a power dynamic. In conversations, the person who talks the most often reveals the most. The person who listens holds more information. And information, especially emotional information, is power. Not manipulative power, relational power. People who listen deeply shape conversations without dominating them. They guide by reflecting. They influence by choosing their moments. That's why their words carry weight. They haven't diluted them. If you recognize yourself here, you may notice something strange. People often ask for your opinion, even though you rarely offer it unsolicited. That's not an accident. Scarcity creates value, and silence creates gravity. Of course, there's a shadow side. Listening fully can become a way of hiding. Speaking selectively can become self-erasure. Some people use quietness to avoid vulnerability, to stay safe, to remain unexposed. They become excellent listeners, but poor participants in their own lives. If that lands a little too close, it's worth asking, when do you stay silent because it's wise, and when do you stay silent because it feels safer than being seen? The difference matters. So which of these feels familiar? The emotional attuner who listens to understand? The systems thinker who waits for the full picture? The cautious speaker shaped by early dynamics? The nuanced feeler who resists oversimplification? Or maybe a mix? Most people who listen fully and speak selectively aren't trying to stand out, but they do. They create space. They slow things down. They remind us that conversation isn't just about expression, it's about attention. And in a world full of noise, that's a quiet form of influence. So take a moment. How do you listen? When do you speak? And what would change if you trusted your voice just a little more, or your silence just a little less? If this felt uncomfortably familiar, you're probably not alone. Share your thoughts in the comments, or just sit with the question. Sometimes the most important conversations happen before we say a word. Sometimes the most revealing part of this pattern shows up after the conversation ends. You replay it in your head, not because you're anxious, but because you're still processing. You remember exactly where the other person's voice softened, where they laughed a little too quickly, where they avoided a word and swapped it for a safer one. And you realize something. While they were talking, you were mapping meaning. People who listen fully often keep a kind of internal transcript, not word for word, but feeling for feeling. And later, when they finally do speak, sometimes hours or days later, it's with a clarity that surprises others. Oh, you were thinking about that the whole time. Yes, you were. This delayed articulation can feel strange in fast-moving relationships. Some people mistake it for emotional distance, others mistake it for detachment. But in reality, it's integration. Your mind doesn't rush to respond because it's busy weaving understanding into something coherent, and coherence, to you, matters more than immediacy. That's why texting back quickly can feel oddly uncomfortable. That's why sometimes you need silence before truth. That's why "let me think about that" isn't a stall tactic, it's a promise. And here's something rarely acknowledged. People like this often struggle in environments that reward constant output, meetings where whoever talks most gets credit, social spaces where silence is treated like absence, platforms where visibility equals value. In those spaces, your strength can feel like a liability. You may start wondering if you should speak more, share faster, react louder, perform engagement so no one misreads your quiet as disinterest. And maybe sometimes that's necessary. But it's also worth remembering this: not every environment deserves your full voice. Selective speech is not withdrawal, it's discernment. You choose contexts where listening deeply is valued, not exploited, where your pauses aren't rushed, where your words aren't skimmed. And when you find those spaces, those people, you often become unexpectedly expressive, animated, even talkative, which surprises everyone who thought they had you figured out. Because the truth is, you were never quiet, you were careful. So if you're someone who listens fully and speaks selectively, here's the quiet challenge. Don't let your gift turn into self-disappearance. Your listening changes rooms, your presence steadies people, but your voice matters too. Not constantly, not performatively, but intentionally. Speak when it feels true. Stay silent when it feels wise, and notice the difference. And if you're someone who knows a person like this, maybe works with them, lives with them, loves them, pay attention to when they speak. Slow down enough to hear it, because when they do talk, they're not filling space, they're offering something distilled, something they listened their way into. Which part of this felt closest to you? Or did it remind you of someone you know but never quite understood? If you want to keep exploring these quiet patterns of human behavior, the ones that don't shout for attention but shape everything underneath, you know where to find this space. Sometimes the people saying the least are telling you the most.